Welcome to Out of the Fold. This episode is about Janice. She runs an online counseling program that helps people who have experienced trauma associated with religion. A link to her website is in the description, and she offered me an opportunity to take part in a group session so I can tell firsthand what it's like. I haven't yet, but I intend to take her up on the offer, and I'll share what it's like after doing so. As I'm sure most of you who have been following the show know by now, I'm a strong advocate for the mental health industry. And, as we talk about in this episode, I've always found enormous value in group work, which is the focus of her counseling. No religious organizations, companies, or individuals were contacted for comments about any of the content of this episode. The views expressed are strictly those of the ones expressing them. Our conversation began on a Sunday afternoon.
So I was raised in Canada. I still live in the same city where I grew up. So now we have maybe 120 or 140,000 people in British Columbia. And it's been a pretty waspy place, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, very evangelical. And my parents were evangelical, charismatic Christians. And it was fine as far as my mom went because she was a pretty easygoing lady, just delightful to be with. But my dad has, personality challenges, narcissism being the chief one. Mm-hmm. But so when a narcissistic man gravitates towards fundamentalism, it just makes it really hard for the family, for the wife, and for the children. So not a lot of liberty there, not a lot of freedom. And from a very young age, I just found life was very serious. My life was about Jesus had died for me. I recognized that as a young child, and that I was guilty and that he had to pay the price for me. And so my role really was to try and convert as many people as possible to save them from hell. Mm-hmm. And I took it seriously. And so I was always kind of on the outside at school. I went to public school, but didn't really feel like I could participate the same as the other kids could because I always had such a burden for them. And so I didn't always fit in very well either. And sometimes I was my own worst enemy. Thinking of it in junior high, I always carried my Bible around with me and wore clothing that maybe had Bible verses and just was very out front about my beliefs, again, because I felt it was my duty to proselytize constantly. And that, that made things painful and lonely sometimes. And I was very involved in my church, always singing in the worship team and doing drama and choir. And that was really my group and my complete identity. Mm-hmm. I had a few years from probably about 17 to 20 where I backslid, as they say, where I was dating a man who was outside the church. And I started to kind of experience secular life, but then had a big reconversion experience in my early 20s and never looked back after that, and married a Christian man who wanted to become a pastor. He wanted to become a theology professor and then become a pastor. So then we moved to a small town in Alberta and attended a very conservative Bible college. And while I was there, I started really going down that fundamentalist rabbit hole and just thinking, boy, if this Bible is true, it's all true. Mm-hmm. And I'm supposed to be following all of it. So I started wearing a head covering. I stopped wearing jewelry, even my wedding ring. I didn't wear makeup, no cable, no TV, no outside influences at all,
Hmm.
and began at that time homeschooling our daughters as well. And they were quite small, 3, 4, not very old, but old enough to be learning to read, and certainly old enough to learn that they needed to be obedient to God and to their dad and to me. So, yeah, and then just being very isolated and insulated in that world. And it seemed in the homeschooling community, it was always almost kind of a competition. Who was holier,
Hmm.
whose children were holier, whose kids could memorize the most verses, whose kids dressed the most modestly, um, whose kids obeyed better. So it's sad when I look at it now, because it was definitely more of a dog and pony show, and didn't give the children freedom and joy.
Yeah.
So, and I was much, I was stricter than my parents had been with me, and it was very heartfelt. I believed all of it, loved Jesus with my whole heart, spent hours a day praying and in devotion, like reading the Bible, and so it really was my life. And then my husband at the time became a pastor, so that became a part of our life too. But things were hard. The marriage was hard. Pastoring was very difficult because you're living in a fishbowl,
Mm-hmm.
and it's never good enough. So the children are watched very closely, and certainly as a wife and mother and pastor's wife, I was under close scrutiny as well. And I think it's like a beach ball that's held underwater for so long, when it finally breaks free. That's how I felt, so constrained. I felt like I was in a corset and I couldn't stay anymore. Things were starting to give way. And because the marriage was having trouble. And then the year that we were pastoring, was just such a difficult year. I didn't really want to be there. I could tell the church wasn't happy with us and didn't want us there. It was in a very tiny town.
Mm-hmm.
And then one day I got a phone call from my mom, and she and my dad had been married about 43 years at that time. And she said to me that she'd been to a lawyer and they were separating. And so I was happy for her, because my dad's very difficult to live with and I wanted her to be free. But it also was terribly shocking. And I wept over it. That was the only family I'd ever known. And it seemed that it was now falling apart. But it also, something clicked inside me, because she was the most Christ like lady that I knew. And I thought, you know what? If she can get out of a very bad marriage and God still loves her, maybe I'm not stuck forever.
Hmm.
So it was just interesting. And of course, my husband and I had some issues as well related to fundamentalism and the strict roles of the wife, because sometimes I chafed under it. I wanted to be able to think for myself and to learn and to study other things, but I didn't have the freedom to do that. And all of the domestic chores always fell to me. And I really disliked that as well. That didn't seem fair. And so the year we were pastoring, my parents split up. And then I also received another phone call saying that my youngest nephew had murdered somebody and he
Oh my
was going
God.
to jail. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was very shocking. He was 16 at the time. Actually, I got a phone call saying that he had killed somebody, and they couldn't find him. And so they were worried he might have hopped on a bus and been coming out to see us, because we were a couple of provinces away. And that if he showed up, I had to immediately contact the RCMP. So that was tense for a little while, as we didn't know what was going on. But the police did set out a dragnet, and they caught him, and it was just so sad and devastating. Of course, we were mortified for the family who had suffered the loss because of my nephew, but we were also dealing with our own grief, knowing that he was going to be going to prison for a long time and he was so young.
Yeah.
So that was just a hard year, and to feel completely unsupported by the church that we were in at the time. And so we left that church. We moved back to British Columbia, and I was still going to church, but it was hard. My husband blamed me for the failure of his ministry, so that was difficult. And then after we moved back, our daughter got sick, and she just got sicker and sicker. And she was eventually diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, and it's type 1 diabetes. And so she needed immediately to start insulin to survive, and she needs insulin every day. And we couldn't afford the cost of the insulin pump and all the strips and everything, and we ended up going bankrupt. So people think of Canada as, oh, it's, free, everything's free as far as medicine goes, but that's not how it works. And it's expensive to live here. And so when our daughter then got sick and we went bankrupt, I just felt like that's it. I've tried harder than anyone else I know to follow all the rules, and to be a good, charitable, kind, merciful person, obeying God. And this is what happens. It was just a shitstorm. It was one thing after another with no reprieve. Like all those things happened within a couple of years. And the marriage, of course, was still unraveling. And I just got to the point where I realized I'm playing a game here. I don't think there is anyone listening, and that the church was largely silent. There were some people who were inclined to wonder about sin in my life. Was I doing something to bring about God's chastisement? And then most of the people were just quite quiet, so there wasn't an outpouring of support. People, especially if you're struggling with depression and you're inside a religious community, it's very hard because you're told just to pray harder, or that God is molding you for something better. And if you go see a counselor, it must be a Christian counselor within the church, and of course they're just going to keep going with the circular reasoning and not really providing much help. So those were tough times, and eventually I just stopped going to church, and the kids were grateful by then. They were early teens, and they didn't like being dragged around to church on Sunday, and my husband had kind of packed it in by then as far as his faith as well, and we just continued to grow apart, and eventually we did divorce, but thankfully I'm very glad to say we're still quite close friends because we were together for about 20 years. So we've been able to retain that friendship, and he still lives in town, and we all still get together for family dinners and enjoy and support one another that way. But it's been quite a journey.
How is your daughter doing now? The one that was diagnosed with diabetes. How's she doing health-wise these days?
Thank you for asking. She's quite a brittle diabetic, which means her blood sugar has been exceedingly hard to control, and so now she's had the disease for about 10 years, and unfortunately she really has some significant comorbidities that come along with it. So she's on permanent disability. She will never be able to hold a job, and she's in the hospital quite frequently. So it's a scary thing because it's a scary disease. But I'll tell you, at least in Canada, we can afford the insulin. It's not like what's happening in the United States, and people are dying because they cannot afford their insulin. My heart breaks when I read those stories. So now that she's on disability, her medical costs are covered, and we're so grateful to the Canadian government for that. But our lives are in a constant state of yellow alert because we don't know if she'll have to go back into the hospital, or what's going on. So that's hard for a young person because she's in chronic pain too, and that makes life just so much more difficult.
Kids are also pretty resilient. You know, it's kind of amazing. Like how's she actually taking it mentally? Like has she sort of adapted to it at this point?
Yes and no. I think chronic pain, if you don't have chronic pain, you'll never quite understand how debilitating
Sure.
it is. Or to be 20 and to be told, well, this is your life, you're just going to have to deal with it. So we visit a lot of specialists to try and get help that way. But I have to say, in general, just she has such a lovely attitude. And of course, both my daughters had front row seats to my deconversion. And I went a little bit crazy. I did. I just, all the things that had been denied me and all the things I had denied myself for so many years, when I decided uh, there are no rules, then that's how I lived my life for a while. And the kids saw me go from someone who was very confining and very controlled and disciplined to just basically a hedonist, just spreading my wings, which in some ways is great, but I wasn't terribly responsible in other ways. And there are things now I think I would have done differently, but the kids, when I've talked to them about it since then, and we're very close, they say, Mom, we always loved you, but you're so much easier. You're so much more fun to be around now. And I say, yeah, that's going to be very true.
Well, you know, your metaphor was perfect. Like a beach ball being held underwater, and then
Oh,
you know
yeah.
when you let go, it just flies up into the
Oh,
air. I mean,
boy. Yeah.
that was perfect.
And
Um,
that's exactly what it was like.
yeah. What now you said they were raised homeschooled, and you know you raised them to be, you know, very religious as well. Did they end up renouncing their faith as well, or do they just have a different take on it than what you ended up teaching them?
Well, so I only homeschooled them for a few years. And when we
Okay.
moved back to Kelowna, I had to go back to work. I had to take a job at our local hospital. And this was important because it was the first time in my adult life that I was regularly spending time with people outside my faith group. And I saw that all the things I feared were not true. Like these people were intelligent, they were kind, compassionate, lots of fun. I mean, the heathens are a pretty fun, pretty fun group.
Yeah.
So it was good for me to get to know them. And actually, so when I started at the hospital, I still had very long hair and I only wore skirts and dresses, and I didn't wear my head covering, but I still looked very conservative. And I gradually loosened up while I was there, and I made friends with one delightful lady. We're still quite close, and she's so intelligent and was just so kind to me. She watched my process as I was trying to figure out what was fact and what was fantasy from all the fundamentalism. And one day she and I were at coffee and I leaned into her and I whispered, because I didn't want anyone else to hear. I said, Heather, I'm starting to think maybe there was no Adam and Eve or a talking snake in a garden.
Hmm.
Maybe it was just a story. And she just burst out laughing. And she said, Oh, my friend, you know, I figured that one out when I was 7, but I'm glad you're I'm glad you're figuring it out. She gave me a big hug, but it was so, for me, even to speak that to her was, I was scared to say that. I didn't
Yeah.
know if lightning might strike. And we were living across from a used bookstore at the time. And that ended up being my salvation because I realized I was going to have to figure things out on my own. So I started hanging out in that little bookshop and going into the back room where it had all the books on occult, you know, alternative religions and stuff. And I was so nervous even to go back there, but I started buying some books that exposed me to other faiths and philosophies, and then, you know, evolution and different things that I had never really been allowed to look into. And bit by bit, I was able to free myself.
Did reading any of those books lead you to like another faith, or I guess this sort of leads well into, what do you believe now?
Well, when that beach ball came up from out of under the water there, I really dove head first into new age type stuff, which really there's nothing new about it. So the crystals and the chakras. Oh, and I grew dreadlocks and I got tattoos, and I really just thought, okay, this is great. I'm so free, and I learned about meditating. I started meditating, and I decided I was going to learn to play the didgeridoo. Do you know what a didgeridoo is?
I do. I love those things.
You didgeridoo, okay. So I bought several of those, and one of my daughters is quite musical, and sometimes we still play our digits together. But I was really just trying to break all the rules and break myself free from all the confining thinking. And so I did that for a few years. But now I would say at this point, I'm definitely agnostic, and I would say listing heavily towards atheism. I don't feel that I can prove for sure that there is no God, but I don't see evidence, and I wouldn't want to serve the God of the Bible.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at these days. And my daughters, you asked about my daughters. I think I've raised them to be free thinkers, and they are free thinkers, and they like to research and learn. And I'm so thrilled about that. And they know that nothing is off limits to them. Whatever they're interested in, they can study. And then we talk about it and find out what each other thinks about this or that. So they are not religious. The younger one with diabetes, she is a hardcore atheist and just does not have time at all for religion. The older one, I think, isn't quite as hard against it, but has no interest in it. And her freedom is very important to her.
Yeah. I consider myself an atheist, but I've noticed that there are a lot of people that think that that it's a difficult step to make, to say that that there is no God, and frankly, that's even a difficult step for me to make. But I don't believe that there is no God. I just don't believe, like, currently in God. And there is there is a distinction there. And I considered myself agnostic for a very long time, but for me, atheism really just means not being convinced currently that God exists. It doesn't mean that, like, if there were direct evidence of there being a God, that I would deny that God. It just means
Right.
that, right now, with evidence to the contrary and with me not being totally convinced of religious texts, it's just like, I don't believe right now that there is a God, but I might one day, if there's evidence to it.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty that's a liberating position to be in. I like that. I think that's good. You're giving yourself ample space and ample room there. And I certainly know, I've seen a lot of people jump from religious fundamentalism to really hardcore and even militant kind of atheism. And to me, those are they're different ends of the same thing. It's fundamentalist this or fundamentalist that. And what I've learned is that for people who are prone to fanaticism, it's the act of devotion that's important, much more important than the object of devotion.
Yeah.
Saul turned into Paul, but it can happen in reverse. Paul can turn into Saul. So I know my own propensities to run too far in either direction, and now my life is constantly searching for the middle.
Well, when you hold the beach ball down like that, I mean, you're doing something extreme. You're holding that thing down. So, like, when it comes up, it's going to come up with the same amount of force. It's going to come up as extremely as it was being held down. So
yes.
I'm not surprised that there are some people that when they reject one extreme dogma, that they go to a whole other extreme dogma.
Yes.
I think that it's like I don't know if saying that they're unbalanced is the right thing, because I think that there are some people that do that, and they're probably not unbalanced. They're just
Hmm.
they're angry, maybe, there's a
Hmm.
lot going on there that
Hmm.
but I think that it's really valuable to have your view. It's really valuable to to just sort of be willing to live in the world of I don't know. Um,
Yes, the ambiguity. And that's what religion hates. That's what fundamentalism hates, is ambiguity. Because we're in fundamentalism, there are rules for everything and it's very rigid. And so that's one reason I was so drawn to it. I felt safe
hmm
there. When I was growing up in a home with such a volatile father, rules were my safety. If I if I knew the rule and I could memorize the rule, pardon me, and obey the rule, he would be less likely to punish me. And my siblings also learned that early on. So that really ingrained in me a love of rules, and that shaped who I became and partly why I was drawn to fundamentalism. So I understand that. And even now, sometimes it's hard being in the gray. It was easier being black and white, but I would never trade where I am now. I feel so free.
yeah. Well, having answers is great. It's a great feeling, like knowing, being totally certain about, especially something like life and death. I mean, if I feel great not knowing, because it opens up this world of questions that I never had access to before. I can appreciate things in a whole new way.
Mm.
But I can see how it could also be terrifying to not be certain about it and see this whole universe. And it's not exciting. It just fills you with anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
For that type of person, it's like, you need this structure. Like, you need something to connect it all, whether it's superstition or magic, or they'd probably accept some sort of science that did seem to do that. There
It was
needs there
very comforting.
Yeah, yeah. There's just something that helps some people about that. But free thinking, I think, is a beautiful thing. It's like
Yes.
when you live your life around free thinking. I don't know is a call to action. It's not a
Hmm.
it's not a it's not a terror. It's a thing that gives you adrenaline because you get to ask another question.
That is great. I love that. I don't know is a call to action because for sure within the church, I don't know meant I better go ask my pastor or I better put my head back in the sand. I
Right.
don't know was a very scary place to be in. I don't know if you're familiar with Marlene Winnell, Dr. Marlene Winnell. She's the one that coined the phrase religious trauma syndrome.
I'm not familiar. No,
Have you heard of religious trauma syndrome?
I have, and I'm not familiar with it yet.
Okay, I wrote it out. It's just a couple of sentences. I thought your listeners might find it interesting.
That'd be great. Yeah, if you could read that,
Okay.
that'd be phenomenal.
Sure. Dr. Winnell is an American psychologist, and she says religious trauma syndrome is a condition experienced by people who are struggling with leaving an authoritarian, dogmatic religion and coping with the damage of indoctrination. She says it's a function of both the chronic abuses of harmful religion and the impact of severing one's connection with one's faith. So it's kind of a double whammy. Like if you grow up like I did, being thoroughly indoctrinated right from the time I was born, I suffered many losses as a result of that. I didn't have a normal kind of joyful, free childhood. I wasn't able to have friends just for friends' sake. It was only for proselytizing.
hmm
I didn't get to do the normal teenage things. So I had losses like that. Certainly, I wasn't permitted to think critically. And then when I left religion, or as I call it, divorce, when I divorced religion,
hmm
I suffered losses on top of that. Then I lost my community. I lost my sense of purpose. I lost my feeling of comfort in knowing how everything would turn out, knowing that I would go to heaven and be reunited with my loved ones. So it's a double whammy. And
Yeah.
I think people don't pay enough attention to it. And we have masses of wounded, silently suffering people, tens of thousands of us, in even just in North America, who have left religion, but who maybe haven't filled that void with anything else, and we're just wandering around feeling isolated and wounded. And that's why I developed my workshop that I had mentioned to you, the Divorcing Religion workshop.
Hmm.
So I didn't know if you wanted me to talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I welcome you plugging it a little bit and letting us know about exactly what you do. So, I mean, it sounds like you obviously do something associated with, helping people who have, experienced religious trauma then.
Yes, absolutely. So when my marriage ended and I left the church, and it was all roughly, a similar time frame, I went back to school in Canada here to get my diploma of applied psychology and counseling. And of course, I was still um, figuring myself out and what was happening. I had lost my faith, and the world looked completely different for me. And so I was on this journey, and now I had in my toolbox I had psychology, and I had a new understanding of language and human experience. And so I developed this workshop. It's a 7-week workshop called the Divorcing Religion Workshop. And it's for anyone who's left a fundamentalist religion. So Catholics, evangelicals, JWs, Mormons, Muslims, for anyone who's coming out of that background. And I wrote 7 modules. 6 of them are on par with a marital divorce. They're kind of reflections of the steps that you go through if you get a divorce from your partner. So the first module is about breaking up is hard to do, realizing it's over.
Hmm.
The next one is uncomfortably numb, the realities of grief, and that is a very important element. The next one is the separation agreement, setting healthy boundaries. And then who are you now? Identity reconstruction, and getting along with your ex, integrating your losses and moving on. And then the last official module is the plenty of fish, finding and building your new communities. And then I put a bonus module in the end called mind control. Don't let an old flame burn you twice. And I want to end my workshops with that one, because those of us who fell victim to fundamentalism, there is a danger that we could fall into it again in other ways, because it's not just religion doesn't have the market cornered on fundamentalism. You can be a fundamentalist regarding your diet or ecology, the environment, or
Hmm.
politics. Because we're human, we can be swayed. It's all our levels of attachment. So I think I'm just going through my first group of participants right now. Today we finished module 3, and it's great. They're really enjoying it and finding it helpful.
That is phenomenal. I love that it's first of all that it's not just somebody who's left a Christ-focused religion. Like you said that you have, former Muslims in there as well. I think that that's great. I mean, it's really important what you're doing. This is an underrepresented community, myself included, but, just the people that I've spoken with. I mean, there are very few people that feel more alienated in the world than
Yes,
people who have lost their faith.
yes,
And
particularly in America.
it's really bad.
Well, and
Um,
the interesting thing is that my workshop is online. So I email the modules out once a week, and everybody has their week to go through and read them and do the exercises. And then we use the Zoom platform, which is a video conferencing platform. So every Sunday morning we get together and we all see each other face to face and talk about what we have learned from the previous week. So someone living in Africa, people could do it anywhere as long as they have access to the internet to
mhm.
participate in our group sessions, because that I feel is a really important part of it, connecting with each other.
How do people access that? Is it just through your website?
The workshop?
Yeah.
Yes, so they can go to www.divorcingreligion.com. And I'm also on Twitter at Divorce Religion and at Wise Counselor. I have both of those handles on Twitter, but they can go straight to the Divorcing Religion website, and it talks about the workshop, and then it has, the application form, and I think I'm offering it fairly inexpensively, um, for all of the amount of work that went into it and for how much I think it's going to help people. And I do have scholarships available too for some folks really want to participate, but they're just so strapped financially. And so it's a limited number, but I'm able to put some people through on scholarship. And I feel like that's my gift. And I want to help as many people as possible. There are participants in the workshop. Um, some have left religion fairly recently, like say within the last year or 2 years. And then I have some people who left years ago, but they never really addressed it. And the age range in this group, I have some people, I think as young as maybe their late 20s or early 30s, and then all the way up to someone who's 70. Yeah. And it's men and women and from different backgrounds, but they can all relate to the sense of loss from leaving their religious community, and they've never maybe addressed the grief or how they've been affected by being in the religion and then by leaving the religion. So they're finding it valuable, and they really appreciate being able to talk with other people who've gone through a similar thing.
Well, I think that it's also it is in like a group setting that you do these things, right? So it's like you and then a bunch of people that are listening and sharing their own stories together.
And we all see each other. It's like if you're looking at the Brady Bunch screen, you're probably too young to remember the Brady Bunch, but we all see and interact with each other in live time when we do the group session on Sunday. So that's for 2 hours. But then otherwise, I just email them the module and they do it separately on their own time that week.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important. I've done I've on my show I've talked very highly about mental health. And what I mean, like obviously being mentally healthy, but the mental health industry as a whole. And partially that's because my dad is actually a psychologist. But besides that though, I hate that there's a stigma associated with mental health. I really do. I think it's absurd. I really hope that at some point in my lifetime that, it's as normal to get a mental health checkup as it is to get a physical one.
Yes.
Like I think we as a society would benefit from that so much. And I've had my own experiences with going to therapy, and, it's definitely helped. But the times that I've, gotten the most out of it, honestly, were in a group setting.
And group work is great.
It's phenomenal, especially for some people who might feel like it's a little bit uncomfortable doing something just face to face. Sometimes that can be more intimidating than being in a group of people that can all interact and talk like that. So I think group work for this type of thing especially, and sorry, maybe not especially, but for this thing definitely group work is great, because you're not just talking to somebody whose beliefs you're not sure about. You're talking to other people who definitely have all been where you are or have been somewhere very similar.
Yes, and I keep the group size fairly small for the workshop. So right now there are 5 people. I would definitely cap it at 8. I wouldn't want any more than 8, because we're only meeting together for 2 hours on Sundays, and everybody needs to have an opportunity to share. And some of the modules are longer than others. So we devote a little bit more time talking about them, but mostly when we're chatting together. So I kind of use the modules as a guide and find out what people thought of this or how they answered that. But really, it just springboards into a lot of discussion for us about how we have been affected by religion in our life, and it's just very healing.
Yeah, no, I think what you're doing is really, really important. So I did actually have a couple of other questions about some of the things that you talked about in your story. First of all, you mentioned briefly that you actually were wearing you were wearing head coverings, which
Yes.
I have to say, you hear about that in Islam, you hear about that in Judaism, you hear about it in Mormonism.
Hmm.
You don't hear about it very much with, you might, yeah, I guess you could say that you kind of hear about it in Catholicism when you think about nuns, but with most other types of Christianity, maybe it's just my own ignorance, but I've seen very few Christians wearing head coverings because of their religion.
Right.
So
If you
I
think of the Amish, it was a similar head covering to what the Amish wear.
yeah. So I guess I'm kind of surprised that you said that you were not getting a lot of support from your church in that really bad year. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, you what more could you have done? Like you were wearing a head covering. You were married at the time, right? To a pastor.
Mhm.
I mean, what the hell else were they expecting you to do?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, interestingly, so I wasn't raised wearing a head covering, and I didn't even know anyone who had ever worn one. And when we moved to this small Bible college town in Alberta, the town was flanked by Mennonites, and these Mennonites were of a particular variety. They were called Holdeman Mennonites or Church of God in Christ Mennonite, and they noticed me in town once I started wearing a covering, and
Hmm.
they sometimes would be brave enough to come up and talk to me, and I was so pleased to be able to talk with some people who took the scripture as seriously as I did. That's how I felt, right? And so then we started fellowshipping with them, although we were never permitted to take communion with them or anything because they still felt, ironically, that we were out of the fold. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, it was so those ladies wore coverings all the time. But then when we left the Bible College campus to go pastor a church in Saskatchewan, it was a Pentecostal church and they didn't wear head coverings. And my husband told me he wanted me to stop wearing a covering. He never really was a big fan of it anyway because he felt um, that it put more responsibility on him. And he was more of a background type of guy, not real comfortable taking on a lot of responsibility that way. So when he asked me and said, "Look, I need you to blend in this community and in this church, and you're just going to make them resent us or think we're weird if you keep wearing that head covering." And it really was hard. I felt so sad because I felt that I was being that I was as close to God as I could be.
Yeah.
So, but I honored my husband and wanted to obey him. So I stopped wearing it. But yeah, it was just a very hard time. And I felt really exposed after I took it off. And it was part of the dismantling of my identity. Then I was no longer a head covering Christian. Then I was no longer a homeschooling Christian. Then eventually I was not even a married um, Christian. Like it was one thing after another. And it was a real stripping away of all these different parts of my identity. And I had to rebuild from the ground up. And like you, I searched online and I couldn't find anything. I didn't even have the language for it. I'd never heard of deconversion. I didn't know to type in the word deconversion. I would just type in Google, not a Christian anymore, or
Hmm.
lost my faith, and see what came up. But there weren't all the different groups there are now. I belong to a wonderful online community now called journeyfree.org, and that's Dr. Marlene Winnell's group. And Marlene is the one who coined the religious trauma syndrome. And her group is marvelous. So there are groups around the world. Um, Also, Recovering from Religion is another tremendous online resource for
Hmm.
people. So I'm glad there are those groups now, and my workshop is just another resource for people.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, if you were trying to do all these things, they still said that you weren't doing. I mean, it sounds like it wasn't even just that you weren't doing enough. It's just like to them you were a square peg and they were a round hole. Like you just weren't the type they were looking for.
I think so. Yep, I think so. And I mean, people are threatened by people who are different.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, such a painful time. And when I stopped going to church altogether, I really thought maybe at least I might get a phone call or a few, people calling, what's going on and are you okay? Didn't really happen. So in the time leading up to it, as I was questioning and chafing and feeling really uncomfortable, that's when I heard from some people about, oh, you're maybe not being obedient enough, or you need to pray harder, or God is just chastising you. But once we left, it was pretty much crickets. Not Nobody came after us, and that made me sad, and that made me wonder. I devoted so much of my life to this community,
Yeah.
and what's there now? And the real trick when you leave is rebuilding communities, because I missed the music, I missed the fellowship, I missed everything about it. It felt like, and it was just a big hole. So it takes work to be responsible for yourself, because Christianity, it disempowers people. Everything is either God's will or God's punishing you or whatever, but you're not encouraged to solve problems on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what you have to do when you leave. You really have to start solving your own problems.
Yeah.
Finding solutions.
How are you doing these days? How are you doing? Like, how are you feeling mentally these days?
Better than I can ever remember feeling, because I definitely struggled with depression towards the end of my faith and the end of my marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And now I just feel like the purpose I have now is helping other people who are in a similar position. And that brings me such joy when someone says, I'm really grateful to be part of this group, or I'm really glad that I could talk to you. That's a wonderful thing to hear. So I feel really good. And I live with a man. I have a partner. He's wonderful, and he is a Jewish person, and he is a Reform Jew. So Reform Judaism is, I want to use the word liberal. I don't know if he'd use liberal, but much more easygoing and relaxed than other parts of Judaism. So when he's talking about God, he almost always says she, like he refers to God in that sense. And he says he doesn't understand the Christian idea of a very personal, interactive God. That's not kind of how it works in Judaism.
Yeah.
And that is so mind-bending to me. And we were watching a Star Trek show one time, a couple years ago, and they were talking about evolution, and my partner started saying, oh yeah, evolution just makes the most sense. And my jaw dropped. I said, you're a Jew. And he's like, correct. I am a Jew. Ding, ding, ding. And I said, how can you say that you believe in evolution? He says, well, what do you believe? And I just started to cry, because I realized the creation story has been so tenacious for me. So even though I'm a much more logical person now and very interested in science and reality, that 6,000 year creationism story was really a hard one for me to get over. And so he's been a real help, because I respect him so much. He's a very intelligent person, and yet he's still quite happy. And I said to him, why are you Jewish? Like, he converted to Judaism. He wasn't born Jewish. And he said he wanted a community. He wanted a community to raise his family in, and Judaism made the most sense to him. And he's still quite happy. And he doesn't mind that I'm not Jewish, and he's extremely supportive of the work that I do. So I've really lucked out as far as partners go.
That's awesome. That's great.
Yeah.
My wife was raised Jewish. She's now non-practicing, but There are a lot of people that were raised Jewish that are taught that they're always Jewish if their mother is Jewish. So
Right.
she
Right.
still considers herself Jewish.
Right.
And frankly, I mean, I've been impressed by Reform Judaism. Like if there's anything, if there is a religion out there that's like the opposite of a cult, it's
Right.
Reform Judaism.
Yes.
They're like, I talked to a guy that whose interview I posted earlier on this year that grew up in Iran. In it was a Muslim majority country, and he was raised Muslim. But he converted to Judaism, and he was basically going to be killed for it. And then he came to the United
Wow.
States and was able to be openly Jewish. But he in Judaism found something that encouraged him to question everything. That encouraged him to question God, to question the Torah, to question all the things that Islam did not want him to question. Um,
Right.
so yeah, I mean, I'm a fan. I'm
Mhm.
a fan of Reform Judaism, and I think I'm not surprised that you're able to get along with somebody who probably does to some degree believe devoutly what he believes, but is able to have a very open minded view
Oh,
of everything.
yeah. He has so much more room than I did. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So much more room to think about things and embrace all sorts of different ideas. And when I think of religion, the only religion I knew was very confining and very personal and with lots of rules and regulations
Hmm.
and punishment. And that seems to be the opposite um, of how it is for him. So it's a joy to share my life with someone like that and who is so accepting of me the way I am.
Yeah. And I think it's great that you still have a relationship with your ex husband. I mean, it sounds like you guys
Yes.
probably. I mean, did religious differences have an impact? Was that one of the things that made you guys end up getting divorced, or was there? If you don't want to answer that, that's okay. I'm just.
Oh yeah, it's no problem. I would say that my deconversion happened sooner and much more rapidly. And sometimes we talk about that. What are you believing these days? And he's pretty honest, and he says, "Oh, I just try not to think about it." He says, "But I don't believe what I used to believe. That's for sure."
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, he wouldn't. It's been many years since he's been to church, and we talk about the loss there, the feeling of losing that community. But I think we've managed to be pretty supportive of each other. And my new partner welcomes him in when we're doing, birthday dinners and, Christmas dinners or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So that makes things easier too. But it's hard when you've shared your life with someone for 2 decades. Um, it can be pretty tricky, the uncoupling there. So we've managed to do it pretty well, and we care enough about each other that we don't ask painful questions or make painful, difficult demands of one another.
Yeah. Sounds like you've built a life,
Yeah.
which is great. You've managed to not only come out the other side of religion, but you've developed a program that's sort of based on your own ability to live the life that's even just the life after you're thinking about whatever life you'll have after religion. Like you've just
Mhm.
got the life you're living now, and that's great.
Yes, and I do feel like I'm living it fully because nothing is off limits to me. And that's such a liberating, beautiful, wide open place to exist in. And it means I can be curious. And I'm so curious about other people, and I love to hear their stories. And it doesn't mean that I have to agree or disagree. It's just their story. And I want them to be able to share it. I think that's why I love podcasts so much, just everybody's stories. What a great medium.
Yeah. I don't think I've got any other questions. Was there anything that you wanted to say? Anything that I didn't ask about that you just wanted to be able to say, whether it's to people of any form or religion, or people who are questioning their faith, people who have left their faith, just anything that you wanted to be able to say that I didn't ask about?
I feel like we've covered things pretty well. It's important for people to understand that religion is fear-based and quite controlling when we're talking about especially fundamentalism, and that they are allowed to leave. Louise Hay said, a belief is just a thought and a thought can be changed. And at first, when I read that, I was actually quite offended because I figured my beliefs were the truth. Mm-hmm. But the older I get, the more I see the wisdom in that. And yeah, people are allowed to change their mind when they receive new information. There are no life police. You're allowed to be yourself and to love whom you want to love and live the life that you want to live.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. Special thanks to Janice for the service that she provides and the warmth with which she told her story. There is no weekly episode this weekend with Faye, due to a wedding-related event that I'm attending until Monday. Make sure to tune back in on the 20th. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a written review with 5 stars. The written reviews help to move the show up the charts. For immediate updates and discussions, follow the show on Twitter @OutFoldPodcast. I started a Patreon and GoFundMe, located at Patreon and GoFundMe.com/OutOfTheFold. If you're listening right now, I'm not asking you to donate. Rather, just keep doing what you're doing and share the show with someone you trust. Logo and artwork by my wife. Production by my wife and I. All music by me. See you on the internet. This has been Out of the Fold.